Okay, so last but certainly not least, let's talk about union jobs. When I think about a truly just transition to clean energy, what comes to mind is community benefits, environmental justice, and of course, family sustaining union jobs. Our final speaker this evening, Frankie Santamond, a union organizer for Maine Labor Climate Council, will share with us about benefits for organized labor in CBAs. Welcome, Frankie.
Thanks, Kel. Good to be here. I love that introduction because really what I want to talk to folks about today is exactly what's at the heart of these clean energy projects we're talking about, which is the workers that build them, that maintain them, and in particular, the workers that come from the region where these projects are being built. So really one of the primary benefits for a host city or region are jobs. So we've heard that today. These have to be good paying jobs with a living wage, jobs that can sustain a family. Because when we're thinking about a just transition, we can't just let things be the status quo, right? We've heard the other discussants talk about uplifting marginalized communities. Those are communities that have been previously impacted by the fossil fuel industry. And so when we're thinking about this clean energy transition and when we're thinking about a just transition, we really need to be thinking about communities and workers at the table shaping the labor standards of these projects. So really briefly, I just want to talk about, what is a union job? What's a non-union job? And what does it mean for so many workers in the trades or in the construction field who are classified as independent contractors, right? These are people that aren't classified as employees. And these are people who aren't protected by the Fair Labor Standards Act, by the National Labor Relations Act. And this is really important, right? Because these are historically communities, Black, people of color, Indigenous people, who find themselves disproportionately classified or misclassified by an employer and not protected by things like workers' compensation or minimum wage. So when we're thinking about building out these projects, it's really important to think about, like, what do these jobs look like? When we're talking about the creation of hundreds or thousands of jobs for a region, are those jobs, like I said, family sustaining jobs? So I want to talk about a couple things that might happen before a community benefits agreement is negotiated. I'm going to talk really briefly about project labor agreements. So these, also known as PLAs, are used primarily in the construction field, but they have been used elsewhere. And they can establish terms of employment for workers on a project, right? This can include wages, benefits, maybe provisions that require contractors to hire through union hiring halls. And these hiring agreements often include things like training, workforce development, which you've heard the other discussants talk about. These are really important things for a community and can also establish guidelines, like in the Salem contract, for example, for hiring underrepresented groups for these projects. So in Maine, we, in the recent past, had LD 1895, which is our offshore wind and labor standards bill, passed through the House and the Senate into law. And this is really exciting for us because a project labor agreement like this will require that clean energy project developers hire union workers whenever possible and local workers, so that this money is going back into the local economy and sustaining families that live in the area. And this is good for a developer too, right? Because there's a skilled workforce available that can complete a project on time, efficiently, prevent delays, and it really focuses on safety and the quality of the project that's being developed. There's also something called a labor harmony agreement, and this too is something that we have been working on here in Maine, kind of as a precursor to a CBA that might be negotiated between a developer and the community. So a labor harmony agreement is different from a CBA, but it can deter or prevent anti-union activities in publicly funded infrastructure projects. And this is really important, right? Because it ensures that public money that's being spent on the development of an offshore wind port, for example, won't be used to fight unionization, while also making sure that these essential climate projects are completed without labor fights slowing things down. So again, this is something that has benefits for both the developer and for the community, for the taxpayer and for the worker. So when we think about a community benefit agreement, there are a variety of them, an increasing number around the US. And in some places, like our colleagues in California, have established maybe MOAs as precursors to community benefits agreements. We've heard a bit about the Salem contract, which I think includes some really exciting commitments from the developer to specific hiring benchmarks, which is really important. But some of the development or some of the benefits for organized labor for workers in these various community benefits agreements that are possible are things such as the establishment of money, for example, to developing career pathways or apprenticeship programs, training programs that really focus on marginalized communities that might have specific benchmarks, again, like the Salem Community Benefits Agreement, to make sure that the developer and the community are clear on those goals over a specific timeline, and to really make sure that there's some accountability built in to a community benefit agreement. That's really important. There also needs to be enforceability built in as well, in some mutually binding method for resolving disputes, whether it's about the language of the community benefit agreement itself or some other labor dispute. And that, again, that's mutually beneficial to have those things in place, because it's one thing to negotiate a legally binding agreement that has goals enumerated. If they're vague, it's a nice idea, but to really have those concrete benchmarks and ways to enforce them is really key, particularly for environmental justice communities who, again, have been disproportionately harmed by fossil fuel industries in the past. Some other examples of community benefit agreement articles or language that really benefits labor, organized labor and workforce development is affordable housing. Again, we heard that the Salem CBA included a one-time payment for affordable housing, and that's really awesome. And, you know, I think in the future, I really encourage people who are thinking about coming together to negotiate a community benefits agreement to really consider what are the needs of the community and the population, and what are the best ways to ensure that families, individuals who want to work in these jobs, who need to be able to afford to live in this area, how are they being supported by this development? Real briefly, a couple other ways that people can negotiate language into a community benefit agreement that will benefit, you know, a broad swath of the community is really focusing not only on education, but on language interpretation, making sure that there is specific pathways for outreach. And when it comes to hiring, again, such as with the Salem CBA, we have these specific benchmarks, I think over a 3, 5, and 10-year period, although you'll correct me if I'm wrong. That's really great. And how is the developer making plans to outreach those populations? And what kind of labor unions are involved with apprenticeship programs, and how are those being supported? Because, you know, there's great plans to build clean energy projects, and there do need to be the workers, the skilled workers available to fill those positions. So this is a really key part of this. Lastly, I thought I'd just add a couple thoughts on negotiating a a community benefits agreement from my experience as a union organizer who has also negotiated CBAs, but collective bargaining agreements, so a very different thing. But what I heard earlier really resonated with me. It's really important for parties involved to agree on their priorities before they get to the bargaining table. And in my experience, that can actually be just as or more difficult than the actual negotiations with a developer, because there are a lot of priorities. And how do you sort through those and, decide which ones are the ones that you're going to bring forward? In some cases, it's easy to find those issues that are widely and deeply felt and amplify those at the table. Other times, there may be issues which are more divisive. And so, how are you going to deal with the mix of sometimes competing interests? And I'll just say this inherent scarcity mentality that can be present during negotiations like these. So, creating a space and having what do need to be trusting conversations, I do agree with that, for people to agree on priorities is really key. And also, always ask for more than what you need to walk away from table with, right? It's really important. I don't think that people can ask for too much because we know a developer isn't going to give more than they can, right? But it is important to ask comprehensively for things that are going to support the community, because ultimately a project like this isn't part of a just transition unless it supports and upholds the communities that it's built in. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Frankie. That was great. And a huge thank you to all of our speakers this evening for sharing your unique and valuable perspectives on community benefits agreements. CBAs are the next big thing, the next big equity conversation in the offshore wind world, and you are all at the forefront of that work. So thank you so much for your really tremendous work on this subject. I'm going to pass it over now to Zara, who's going to make some announcements, and then over to Jennifer, our Coalition Communications Director, who's going to facilitate the Q&A portion of this webinar. Thank you so much.